This story didn't happen to me, but it has been happening to my coworker. The story is still developing, but a lot has happened, and it's enough to creep me out, so I figured I'd share it. About a year ago, I believe, is when it all started. I work at a grocery store in the drugstore department with my friend David. He's a nice guy, very mild-tempered and kind, and maybe a tiny bit, desperate is a mean way to put it. The thing is, he just hasn't found the right girl. So he met Emma at work shortly after I started working there. From what I heard from David, she came up to him one day and passed him a piece of paper with her name and number, saying that she wanted to get to know him. David thought she was pretty cute, and the way she approached him was nice, so they started texting. And this is where things get a bit strange. It started with the same old, don't text her back for an hour, but then she started asking why he wasn't answering her. And eventually, it turned into her coming to the store to watch him work. She even started leaving Bible verses around the store. Not just any Bible verses, but all Bible verses about lust and bearing children. David would usually tell me about her, about how weird she acted leaving these pieces of paper with scriptures to look up and telling him how they belong together. Mind you, this was only about 2 months after they met. David finally got the crazy vibes and told her he didn't want to talk to her, that she was coming on too strong, and he blocked her number. He even had to go to his service provider to get a new one in the end. The last message he got from her was one saying that he would come to his senses one day and want to be with her. When he was ready, she would forgive him. After a while of not letting her contact him, she showed up at the store more and more often. She would no longer leave Bible verses, but instead would stalk him around the store. Her whole family knew about him and would glare at David because he had turned her down. From what I heard, she had been telling her family that he was the one God wanted for her, and that they were destined to be together. Her grandma would usually take her to see him, and one day he saw them and, as usual, ignored them. But she didn't seem to like that, and threw a block of cheese at him. That's right, cheese, straight from the deli department. Her grandma even hit him with her cart, full on ramming it into his back. David was livid at this point. Emma had harassed him for months, and now her family was part of it. He ended up calling security, and the management got her banned from the store, so she isn't allowed within 200 feet, but her grandma is still allowed in because it's her first offense. That was the last of Emma for a while. I went on an extended vacation back in July, and David and I kept in touch. Just before I returned home, he told me he had feelings for me, and I, being very non-confrontational, told him as nicely as I could that I only saw him as a friend. I was worried that things would be tense between us when I got back, but it all went pretty well and things were back to normal. Anyway, in October, David told me about how she was contacting him again through Facebook, now asking him if they could dress as vampires together for Halloween, which David thought was pretty strange since neither of them had plans, but by the time December rolled around, my coworker came to tell me that David had a girlfriend. And you can guess who it was. David and I had been distant for a while now, even after mending what happened after my vacation, so it made a lot of sense. Katie, my coworker, told me that David had gone over to Emma's house and they hooked up. But it gets really mental here. After they had sex, she took the condom and put it in her fridge and told David, "If you ever try to leave me, I will have a way to keep you around." I'm not sure how well freezer semen keeps, but creepy nonetheless. She ended up Facebook stalking all of his friends, even our 40-year-old cashier who commented on his pic. Emma said that she lived by the same park, and that she sees her walking on weekends. Since he had feelings for me in the past, it looks like she did her research on me as well. David has to keep a safe distance or else she flips. Everyone at work knew about their relationship except for me, but I think that's because of the feelings he had for me, which is understandable. Basically, Emma checks all his text and private messages. She searches his phone every time they're together, and just a week or so ago, when we were having a Christmas party, David wanted to go, but Emma, for obvious reasons, wasn't invited. When David said he was going, Emma told him, "You can go, but just see what happens." None of us know what the hell that meant, but we all hope that he gets out of that mess of a relationship quickly. I'm not sure if there will be much to update since I'm hoping that David breaks up with her soon. But if any of you have advice that David might use, feel free to let me know. Sorry if this isn't too creepy, but it is the weirdest thing that's happened to my friends. A little background. I, Samantha, was an only child until the age of 10 when my mother married her current husband Tom and had 2 children. One 10 years younger than me and one 13 years younger. Tom and I never really got along, and we all lived in a small, quiet neighborhood away from the main streets. When I was 16, I decided to have my friend Cindy sleep over to celebrate her graduating high school the next week. She was close with my mother since my mom and stepdad were both her teachers in the 7th and 8th grade. We have an awesome time hanging out, and we get a text from some guys who live down the street to come smoke some pot with them when my parents go to bed. Of course, being little shithead teens, we jump on this opportunity. Walking down the street at 1 a.m. in short pajama shorts and tank tops, this group of guys drive down the street whistling, obviously drunk as they all had beers in their hands, calling for us to hop in and go with them. We politely decline and continue on our journey up the street to our prize. We hang out for an hour or so with our friends from school, smoke, and then we are off on our merry way back home, and it is about 2:30 a.m. As we go to turn onto my street, a small black car drives by us and stops and just sits there. Immediately, I panic, thinking that it's my stepdad driving my brother and sister around to get them to go to sleep, since he often did this. Fuck, that's Tom, what the hell? Obviously, we hide, hoping he didn't confirm that it was us. Tom hops out of the car, laughing. He can't see us, so he hops back in the car and then slowly drives by where we are hiding, while we run from end to end of the car, crouched down. We do this for a few minutes, all the while his windows are down and he is cackling maniacally. He gets back out of the car, not saying a word, and starts reaching under the car for us, actually grabbing my leg at one point. I'm freaking out, wondering why he wouldn't just yell at me and make us go home. At this point, I have this weird, uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach, and I grab my friend and make a break for it. He drives down the street at like 50 miles per hour, looking for us. At this point, I turn to Cindy and I'm like, okay, we have to get inside before he gets home. Considering that we are high out of our minds, scared that we're going to get caught, this seems like a good idea. We book it down the road, and then the car drives up the road. Just in time, Cindy skids into the flower bush right below my street-facing bedroom window, and I dash behind my mother's SUV, which is parked on the curve. The engine revs a few times, and the laughter continues, and then my psycho stepdad drives away. Cindy climbs inside and holds the blinds for me to get in, and I literally dive through the window. We jump in my bed and just try to calm down. Never once do we hear a door open signaling that Tom came back inside. The next day, he doesn't say a word, and my mom never confronts me. So for the creepy part, 5 years later, I am drinking a glass of wine with my mom and Tom and ring up that night, saying all of this stuff about how hilarious it was and that I was so surprised he never said anything to my mom. And Tom turns to me with a freaked out look on his face. Sam, that wasn't me. I didn't even know you snuck out that night. After making him swear that he wasn't lying to me, I was sick. There was someone else out there, chasing us, trying to get at least one of us for who knows what reason. My grandparents live on a small farm in rural America. Though the farm itself is quite small, we own much of the surrounding land, and so I spend a lot of my summers cutting apart downed trees and burying roadkill from the roads that border the property. I'm not a particularly small girl. I'm 5'9", and even though I'm on a slenderer side, I can quite easily move a killed deer or chop a tree to pieces. Much of my grandparents' property is deep woods. It's not connected to a major road or even a service path, and is only bordered by other farms. There are two exceptions to this, however. The small north-south running main road where the house sits, and the side road, which is an out-of-service fire road, used by firemen to access the mountains behind us in case of a fire. As far as I know, no one lives up there, and the only time we ever use it is because it's a semi-clear, cropless and floraless path that winds from the far westish side of the main road to the barn, and so it's convenient to drag down trees along that road when we're taking them to be chopped for firewood. You can barely see the house from the side road, and the only real way to see it is to be in the barn itself. My grandparents stop working every day around 6 p.m. to start preparing dinner, and I usually help. But one summer day, a few years ago around 2012, we had had a thunderstorm the previous day, and more were on the way. I was determined to move all of the downed trees back to the trunk pile where we keep the falling trees before chopping them down. It was around 7-ish, so still bright out, but as it was late summer, it was beginning to get a little on the dimmer side, and I knew that I didn't have a lot of time to finish up my chores and get back to the house in time. I was finally old enough that I was allowed to use my grandparents' chainsaw to take apart the trees on my own. Before, I had been limited to dragging the branches and to splitting the trunks with an axe, but I relished the privilege of sawing things into pieces. My grandfather had been working with me earlier that day to take apart the trees though, so I hadn't been using it all that much because he was much more quick and efficient with it. So to recap, my grandfather and grandmother are in the house and it's late afternoon, not a soul in sight, and I am alone on a semi-abandoned road pulling 100-ish pounds of trees back to the barn. As I was pulling the main trunk of the trees along the dirt road, I had the neck prickling feeling that you sometimes get in the woods, that there's another human or an animal around. Now, our property's woods line up pretty well with another farm's woods, and those farmers had kids around my age, so it wasn't unheard of to see them tromping around in our woods, especially during hunting season. But as I said before, it was summer, which is nowhere near deer season, or any other animal season as a matter of fact. So I was a bit nervous. I knew that if any animal came at me too quickly, I'd be totally screwed. Because while I could pull a tree trunk at a walk pace, there was no way in hell that I could run with one, and it was strapped across my chest pretty tightly. Still, I picked up the pace, thinking to myself that it would be my last drag of the day and that I would go inside soon. I came around the corner to the barn, quickly unhooked the chains from my chest, and rolled the log into the pile of its fellows. As I turned, immediately behind me, standing barely 10 feet away, was a young man, in his 30s I'm guessing, holding my chainsaw, which was covered in reddish sawdust, and watching me. Nothing really seemed off to me about this guy other than that he was on our land uninvited. He was dressed like a camper, hiking boots, duffel bag, and a baseball cap and shades. And since we're fairly near a nature reserve, it didn't seem completely impossible that this had gotten lost and wandered onto our land. Like I said, there was a fire road leading up onto the mountains that I had just dragged a log for half a mile on. Conceivably, he could have walked down on it too. He said his name was Alan, and that he had seen me when he was walking from the hill behind and above me, and had seen that I had left my chainsaw behind. He waited a while to see if I was going to come back for it, but after 15 minutes of watching the sky darken, he had decided to return it so it wouldn't be out in the coming storm. I was quite pleased. It was the first time my grandfather had let me finish up a tree clearing on my own, and I would have been seriously embarrassed if I had left his tools out to rust or varnish in a mudslide. Alan asked me where he was and whose land this was, and cheerfully offered to help me stack up the rest of the logs and pull a tarp over them so that the rain didn't bother them as we talked. I, being friendly and quite relieved to be done with my work for the day, chatted about my grandparents and our land, and mentioned that they were both in the house, pointing up the hill and across the fields to the White House in the distance, making dinner, and that I'd have to head back soon if I wanted to get home before dark. He seemed quite sad about that, and said that he was lost and needed to get back towards the trail. I was more than happy to show him the way back. Since I no longer had my load, he had saved my ass by returning the chainsaw, and because our personal paths through the woods are quite twisty. Just as we were finishing up, we heard a loud bang from the barn, and Alan looked really nervous. I laughed, trying to reassure him, saying that my grandfather was probably still in the barn and had dropped something. I turned to look at the barn, trying to see my grandfather inside, and he came out from inside, calling at me before he saw me standing there. He then came over to me, scolding me for staying out so close to dark. I apologized, explaining that I had wanted to finish up and had almost forgotten the chainsaw, but a nice hiker had brought it along for me and dropped it off, at which point I turned to gesture to Alan, who was gone. My grandfather came up beside me and looked at me with a funny look on his face. He asked me why I didn't remember that he had brought the chainsaw back to the barn with him. He had instructed me to finish carrying the logs back before the rain came, and he told me that since there had been flash floods the night before and were scheduled for this upcoming night, that no park ranger of the local park would have let hikers into the area because of how unsafe it all was. We turned to look at the place that Alan had been, and at the duffel bag and chainsaw, both of which had been left behind. Upon inspection, the chainsaw was indeed not ours. It was the same brand, but far older, and the reddish flakes around the blades were definitely not sawdust. I prayed at that time that it was animal blood, since I do know that some people use chainsaws to take apart dead, rotten deer before burial or to make them more easily scavengeable by local animals. But in light of what was inside of his duffel bag, this seems unlikely. There wasn't anything inside the bag that you would need for camping. Instead, inside his duffel bag was a tarp, several trash bags rolled tightly together, duct tape, condoms, zip ties, and a collapsible shovel. My grandfather took the duffel bag to the trash lot the next day, and we both decided that 1, I would never be allowed out of sight of the house again without a rifle, and 2, that we would never breathe a word of this to my over-anxious grandmother.